Pacific theater pilots, how one captain's crazy, low-level attack changed naval warfare. Forever, Captain Bill Ben shouldn't have survived. On March 3, 1943, he brought his B-25 Mitchell bomber down to wave-top height over the Bismarck Sea, so low that spray from the propellers left salt streaks on the windscreen. Every instinct screamed against what he was doing. Bombers belonged at altitude, where thin air and distance provide safety. Coming down to masthead level meant flying through a curtain of anti-aircraft fire. Every gun on a Japanese convoy able to track you, lead you, kill you. Yet Ben pressed forward, throttles wide open, airspeed touching 250 miles per hour, just 50 feet above the water. His bomb aimer called ranges through the intercom, voice steady despite knowing they were betting everything on a technique that existed nowhere in any manual. Ahead, a Japanese destroyer turned hard to port, trying to present a smaller target. It didn't matter. Ben held course until the ship's hull filled his windscreen, then released. The bombs left the aircraft at nearly zero altitude, hitting the water and skipping like stones thrown across a pond. They bounced once, twice, then slammed into the destroyer's waterline below the armor belt, detonating against the hull where ships were most vulnerable. The explosion lifted the destroyer's bow clear of the water. By the time Ben pulled up and away, the ship was already listing, seawater flooding compartments that were never designed to take hits at that angle. What Ben had just executed was skip bombing, a technique so dangerous and so effective that it would transform the Pacific Air War. But the story of how American pilots developed this method involves more than just tactical innovation. It required understanding why conventional bombing had failed so catastrophically, why desperate circumstances demanded desperate solutions, and how a handful of pilots betting their lives on physics and intuition created a weapon the Japanese Navy couldn't counter. The Pacific Theater in early 1943 presented American airmen with problems that European combat never forced them to confront. In Europe, strategic bombing meant hitting factories, rail yards, and cities. Large targets where even scattered bomb patterns achieved results. Precision meant putting bombs within 500 yards of the aim point. Against German industry, that was adequate. But Japanese shipping didn't span 500 yards. A destroyer measured perhaps 400 feet long and 40 feet wide. A transport ship might be larger, but still represented a target that conventional high-altitude bombing struggled to hit. The mathematics were brutal. A B-17 dropping bombs from 20,000 feet faced wind drift, altitude estimation errors, timing delays in release mechanisms, and the simple reality that bombs didn't fall straight down. They traced ballistic arcs influenced by the aircraft's forward motion, atmospheric conditions, and pure chance. Combat statistics from 1942 revealed the scope of the problem. American heavy bombers conducting anti-shipping strikes in the Southwest Pacific achieved hit rates below 2%. For every 100 bombs dropped on Japanese vessels, 98 missed, splashing harmlessly into the ocean. From an operational perspective, this was catastrophic. Each bomber carried perhaps 8 500-pound bombs, meaning you needed to sortie 6 aircraft to guarantee a single hit, assuming the statistics held. But statistics didn't account for Japanese fighters, anti-aircraft fire, or mechanical failures that reduced effective bombing runs. In practice, sinking a single ship might require 20 or 30 bomber sorties, consuming fuel, ordnance, and air crew time that couldn't be easily replaced in the remote Southwest Pacific. General George Kenney, commanding the 5th Air Force in Australia, faced this arithmetic daily. His mission was interdicting Japanese supply lines, preventing reinforcements from reaching New Guinea and the Solomon Islands. But as bombers were missing, Japanese convoys steamed through the Bismarck Sea delivering troops and supplies, whilst American B-17 and B-24s burned fuel and dropped bombs into empty ocean. The Japanese weren't even taking significant evasive action. They simply sailed on schedule, knowing that American bombing accuracy made interception unlikely. Kenney needed a solution, and conventional doctrine wasn't providing one. The origins of skip bombing trace back to an unlikely source: the Royal Navy's experiences in the Mediterranean. British Beaufighter crews attacking Axis shipping had experimented with low-level bomb release, discovering that bombs dropped at high speed and low altitude would skip across the water rather than immediately sinking. The technique was dangerous, requiring pilots to fly directly into defensive fire, but it dramatically improved accuracy. Information about these experiments reached the Southwest Pacific through intelligence channels in late 1942. Major Ed Larner, a bombardment squadron commander stationed at Port Moresby, read the reports with intense interest. Larner had flown enough anti-shipping missions to understand that conventional bombing wasn't working. The prospect of a technique that improved hit rates, regardless of danger, deserved investigation. The physics behind skip bombing were straightforward in theory, complex in execution. A bomb dropped from sufficient altitude would fall nearly vertically into the water and sink. But a bomb released at high speed and low altitude retained substantial forward momentum. When it hit water, instead of penetrating immediately, surface tension and the bomb's velocity caused it to ricochet, bouncing across the surface like a flat stone thrown by a skilled hand. The key variables were speed, altitude, and angle. Too high and the bomb simply fell conventionally. Too low, and it might detonate on first water impact before reaching the target. Too slow, and it wouldn't skip effectively. The sweet spot existed around 200 to 250 miles per hour at 50 to 100 feet altitude. Under these conditions, a properly fused bomb would skip perhaps 200 to 300 yards, bouncing several times before striking the target's hull at or below the waterline. This approach solved the accuracy problem through geometry. Instead of dropping bombs from 3 miles up and hoping ballistic calculations were correct, pilots could visually aim at the target, releasing when the ship filled their windscreen. The bomb's skip carried it the final distance, striking with far greater reliability than high-altitude release. Against a ship 400 feet long, the margin for error expanded dramatically. You didn't need perfect timing, just reasonably good judgment about when the bomb's skip trajectory would intersect the hull. But the technique demanded flying directly toward heavily armed vessels at minimum altitude, presenting every gun crew with an ideal target. Japanese warships and transports bristled with anti-aircraft weapons: 25mm autocannons, 13mm machine guns, and 127mm dual-purpose guns that could depress to engage aircraft at wave-top height. Flying straight and level at 50 feet meant offering yourself to all of them simultaneously, trapped in a cone of fire with no room to maneuver and no altitude to trade for speed. Major Larner began experimenting in January 1943, using B-25 Mitchells from the 91st Bombardment Squadron. The Mitchell was ideal for the role: twin-engine reliability, good low-level handling, sufficient speed to minimize exposure time, and the ability to carry meaningful bomb loads at low altitude. Larner's initial tests used practice bombs dropped against floating targets in Milne Bay, with crews making repeated runs at varying speeds and altitudes. The early attempts were educational in unpleasant ways. The first run, made at 100 feet and 180 miles per hour, saw the bomb nose into the water immediately, creating a spectacular geyser but no skip. The second run at 50 feet and 200 miles per hour achieved a single weak bounce, the bomb sinking after traveling perhaps 50 yards. The third run, faster and lower, produced what Larner was hoping to see: multiple skips carrying the bomb 200 yards across the water before it finally sank. The problem was consistency. Some bombs skipped beautifully, others didn't. The variables were maddeningly difficult to control. Wind conditions affected the bomb's trajectory. Sea state mattered. Choppy water disrupted skips that smooth water allowed. Bomb fusing became critical. Standard nose fuses detonated on first water impact, defeating the entire technique. Larner needed delayed fuses that would survive multiple water strikes before detonating against the target's hull. Ordnance officers initially resisted the unorthodox requirements. Delayed fuses were designed for penetration bombing, where you wanted the bomb to burrow into a structure before exploding. Using them for skip bombing meant accepting that some bombs would skip completely over or past targets without detonating. But after reviewing combat statistics showing 98% of conventional bombs missing anyway, the objections weakened. Larner got his delayed fuses. By February 1943, the 91st Squadron had developed reasonably consistent technique. Attacks would be made at 50 feet, 220 to 240 miles per hour, releasing bombs approximately 300 yards from the target. Under ideal conditions, hit probability approached 30 to 40%, a revolutionary improvement over high-altitude methods. But ideal conditions meant clear weather, calm seas, isolated targets, and crucially, practice that combat would never permit. The real test came on March 2, 1943, when reconnaissance aircraft spotted a major Japanese convoy steaming toward Lae in New Guinea. 16 transports escorted by 8 destroyers, carrying approximately 7,000 troops of the 51st Division, desperately needed to reinforce Japanese positions in New Guinea. The convoy represented precisely the target Kenny had been waiting for, and precisely the opportunity to prove skip bombing under actual combat conditions. General Kenny committed everything available: B-17s for high-altitude strikes, A-20 attack bombers with forward-firing guns to suppress anti-aircraft fire, and crucially, modified B-25s from the 91st Squadron flying skip bombing profiles. The battle would occur over multiple days as American aircraft intercepted the convoy in the Bismarck Sea, but the skip bombing attacks would determine whether the Japanese transports survived to deliver their troops. Captain Bill Benn led the first skip bombing wave on March 3rd, taking 12 B-25s down to wave-top height in broad daylight. What followed was 3 minutes of absolute chaos. Japanese destroyers threw up walls of anti-aircraft fire, tracers drawing geometric patterns across the sky. The B-25s bored through it, crews watching shells detonate at their altitude, close enough that shrapnel rattled against fuselages like hail on sheet metal. Ben's target was a destroyer attempting to screen the transport ships. He brought his Mitchell down to 40 feet, lower than he'd ever practiced, low enough that his co-pilot later swore he could see individual sailors manning deck guns. The release came at 250 yards, the bombs leaving the aircraft and hitting water almost simultaneously. The first bomb skipped 3 times, striking the destroyer amidships. The second hit near the stern. Both detonated below the waterline, exactly as intended. The destroyer began sinking immediately, its machinery spaces flooding through holes that damage control parties couldn't reach. 2 other B-25s attacked the same destroyer, their bombs striking an already crippled target. Within 4 minutes of the attack beginning, the destroyer was gone, its bow pointing skyward before sliding beneath the Bismarck Sea. The transports received no mercy. Ben's squadron made repeated runs, methodically working through the convoy whilst Japanese gunners fired desperately. The hit rates were extraordinary. Of the 12 B-25s making skip bombing attacks in that first wave, 9 achieved direct hits on their primary targets. 3 transports were sinking before the aircraft even cleared the area. The technique worked exactly as hoped, but the cost was immediate and brutal. 2 B-25s were shot down during their attack runs, killed by concentrated fire they couldn't evade. A third limped away streaming smoke, its hydraulics destroyed, crew nursing it back toward Port Moresby on a wing and a prayer. The battle continued through March 4th, with additional skip bombing attacks targeting the surviving transports. By the time Japanese aircraft from Rabaul established fighter cover, it was too late. 8 transports and 4 destroyers had been sunk. The remainder retreated, harassed by continuing air attacks. Of the 7,000 troops originally embarked, fewer than 3,000 reached Leh. The rest drowned when their ships went down or died from exposure in the water. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea marked a turning point in Pacific air naval warfare. For the first time, American air power had decisively defeated a major Japanese convoy using methods that could be replicated and taught. Skip bombing had proven itself catastrophically effective against targets that conventional bombing couldn't reliably hit. But the technique's success came with uncomfortable realities that would shadow its employment for the remainder of the war. The casualty rates among skip bombing crews were appalling by any standard. During the Bismarck Sea action, the 90th Squadron lost 3 aircraft from 12 sorties, a 25% loss rate. Under normal circumstances, such attrition would be unsustainable. Bomber Command in Europe considered 5% losses per mission to be the upper limit of acceptable casualties. Beyond that threshold, units couldn't maintain operational strength through replacements. But the Pacific Theater operated under different mathematics. Japanese convoys represented strategic targets whose destruction justified heavy losses. A transport sunk meant troops that would never reinforce New Guinea, supplies that would never reach embattled garrisons, aircraft that would never fly combat missions. The strategic value of interdiction exceeded the tactical cost in aircraft and crews. At least according to the calculations made by generals far from the gunfire. Pilots and crew members faced these calculations more personally. They understood that skip bombing missions meant flying into concentrated fire with minimal chance of evasion. Some volunteered eagerly, viewing the technique as finally giving them weapons that worked against elusive targets. Others requested transfers, unable to sustain the psychological strain of repeated low-level attacks. Both responses were understandable. War makes different demands on different people. The technique spread rapidly through 5th Air Force squadrons as word of the Bismarck Sea success circulated. By April 1943, 4 B-25 squadrons had converted to skip bombing doctrine, training crews in the procedures Larner had developed. The training emphasized several critical factors beyond just flying low and fast. Bomb fusing remained paramount. Delayed fuses had to be set correctly, typically for 4 to 5 seconds of delay after impact, allowing the bomb to survive multiple water strikes. Approach angles mattered enormously. Attacking from directly ahead or astern presented smaller target profiles but simplified the defender's firing solution. Attacking from a beam offered larger targets but meant flying across the ship's length, exposed to more guns for longer periods. Most pilots preferred slight angles off the bow, compromising between target size and exposure time. The optimal release point varied with conditions but generally fell around 300 to 400 yards from the target. Release closer, and you risked being caught in your own bomb blast. Release farther, and the skip might exhaust before reaching the hull. Crews practiced endlessly against makeshift targets, learning to judge distances by eye rather than instruments. At 240 miles per hour, you covered 350 feet per second. The margin between perfect release and complete miss was measured in heartbeats. Weather conditions affected every variable. Wind pushed bombs off course during the skip. Rough seas disrupted the physics entirely, causing bombs to nose into waves rather than skipping cleanly. Heavy weather often forced cancellation of skip bombing missions despite target opportunities, frustrating crews who understood that Japanese convoys sailed regardless of conditions. The defensive response from Japanese forces evolved rapidly once they understood what Americans were attempting. Destroyer escorts began positioning themselves to screen transports, deliberately accepting hits to protect more valuable cargo ships. Anti-aircraft weapons were repositioned to create interlocking fields of fire at low altitude, turning approach corridors into kill zones. Some ships deployed steel cables between masts, hoping to snare low-flying aircraft. These adaptations increased the danger for attacking crews, but they didn't fundamentally solve the Japanese problem. Skip bombing was simply too accurate to be defeated by incremental improvements in defenses. The only reliable counter was fighter cover, but Japanese air strength in the Southwest Pacific was already stretched thin by attrition and logistical difficulties. Providing continuous fighter escort for convoys required resources the Japanese increasingly couldn't spare. This created a vicious cycle where convoys became more vulnerable, losses mounted, and the strategic situation deteriorated further. By mid-1943, skip bombing had become standard doctrine for anti-shipping operations throughout the theater. The technique appeared in official training manuals, complete with diagrams showing approach angles, release points, and bomb trajectories. What had begun as experimental procedure developed by a handful of desperate pilots became institutionalized knowledge taught to every crew assigned to maritime attack roles. But institutionalization brought its own problems. The technique required skill and courage that couldn't simply be taught in training programs. New crews arriving in theater understood skip bombing theoretically, but lacked the practical experience to execute it under fire. Their first operational missions often ended catastrophically, aircraft shot down by defensive fire they weren't prepared to face, or bombs released incorrectly because theoretical knowledge hadn't translated to instinctive timing. Squadron commanders developed mentorship systems where experienced crews flew alongside new arrivals, demonstrating proper techniques during actual attacks. This improved survival rates but increased the risk to veteran crews who were being asked to fly additional missions for training purposes. Some veterans accumulated 40 or 50 skip bombing attacks, extraordinary numbers given the attrition rates. Their survival was part skill, part luck, and part something harder to quantify. The psychological toll manifested differently across crews. Some pilots became coldly mechanical, flying attack runs with a motionless precision born from repetition. Others showed signs of strain, hands trembling during briefings, judgment deteriorating under accumulated stress. Flight surgeons identified cases where combat fatigue made continued operations dangerous, but replacement crews weren't always available. Men flew missions they shouldn't have because the alternative was leaving gaps in attack formations. By late 1943, the strategic situation in the Southwest Pacific had shifted dramatically from the desperate days of early 1942. By late 1943, the strategic situation in the Southwest Pacific had shifted dramatically from the desperate days of early 1942. American forces held air superiority, Japanese shipping losses had strangled supply lines, and the advance toward the Philippines was accelerating. Skip bombing had contributed substantially to this reversal, but it had never been the only factor. Naval victories at Midway and Guadalcanal, submarine warfare interdicting Japanese logistics, and simple American industrial capacity all played crucial roles. What skip bombing had accomplished was making American air power relevant against naval targets in ways that conventional bombing never achieved. It transformed bombers from ineffective weapon systems making largely symbolic attacks into precision strike platforms capable of destroying ships reliably. This forced Japanese naval planning to account for air threats in ways previously unnecessary, diverting resources toward air defense that couldn't be used offensively. The technique also validated tactical innovation emerging from operational necessity rather than institutional planning. Skip bombing wasn't developed by research facilities or testing programs. It emerged from combat pilots recognizing that doctrine wasn't working and being willing to try something different. The lesson was clear. Organizations that allowed field experimentation and embraced successful innovations, regardless of source, gained advantages over those that insisted on centralized control. Captain Bill Benn survived the war, completing his tour in late 1943 and returning to the United States. He'd flown 67 combat missions, 41 of them skip bombing attacks against Japanese shipping. His Distinguished Service Cross citation mentioned extraordinary heroism and exceptional flying skill in actions against enemy naval forces, bureaucratic language that couldn't capture what those missions actually entailed. Ben rarely spoke about his experiences afterward, though colleagues noted he never flew recreationally after the war. Major Ed Larner received promotion to lieutenant colonel and command of an entire bombardment group, leading skip bombing operations through 1944. He developed refinements to the basic technique, including tactics for attacking convoys with multiple ships requiring coordinated releases to prevent defensive maneuvering. His innovations saved lives by improving efficiency, allowing attacks to be completed faster with less exposure to defensive fire. The casualty statistics for skip bombing units remained sobering throughout the war. Squadrons specializing in low-level anti-shipping attacks suffered loss rates consistently higher than other bomber units. The 90th Bombardment Squadron, the first to employ skip bombing operationally, lost 40% of its assigned aircraft over 18 months. Replacement crews filled the gaps, but the human cost was never truly calculated in ways that captured individual tragedy. Post-war analysis recognized skip bombing as one of the Pacific theater's significant tactical innovations, ranking alongside submarine warfare and carrier aviation in effectiveness against Japanese maritime logistics. The technique didn't win the war by itself, but it contributed substantially to strangling Japanese supply lines and accelerating the Allied advance. Military historians studying the campaign consistently highlight skip bombing as an example of adaptive innovation under pressure. Modern precision-guided munitions have largely eliminated the need for skip bombing's dangerous close-range delivery. Anti-ship missiles can be launched from beyond visual range, guided by radar and GPS to strike targets with near certainty. The physical courage required by skip bombing crews is no longer necessary because technology has provided solutions that don't depend on human beings flying through walls of fire at wave-top height. But the broader lessons remain relevant. When existing methods fail, innovation often emerges from unexpected sources. Institutional resistance to unproven techniques can be overcome by demonstrable success, and tactical advantage belongs to organizations willing to experiment, learn from failures, and rapidly disseminate successful innovations regardless of their origin. These principles apply beyond military aviation, touching any field where established doctrine confronts changing circumstances. The B-25 Mitchells that flew skip bombing missions have largely disappeared from existence. Most were scrapped after the war, their aluminum recycled into peacetime products. A handful survive in museums, their placards mentioning anti-shipping operations, but rarely detailing the specifics of what that meant. The men who flew them are mostly gone now, their experiences fading with them into history,